you had indicated that there was no recommendation in respect of the low fat diet because it causes heart disease. Does the low-fat diet cause any other diseases?
The low-fat diet has been discontinued as the official recommended policy by the U.S. Dietary Guidelines because it causes heart disease. What is the evidence that the low-fat diet causes other kinds of disease, actually causes those other kinds of disease? We have some evidence from Professor Noakes himself. He did an analysis of the Women's Health Initiative. If you'll remember, that was the trial on nearly 49,000 women over 7 years. He did an analysis. That was actually how I first got in contact with Professor Noakes in 2013. This is in my book on page 171, where he found that the women with the least insulin resistance at the start of the trial were actually at greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes if they were assigned to the low-fat diet compared to the control diet. And the low-fat diet also worsened glucose control in women with diagnosed diabetes. And so the authors concluded that the authors of the Women's Health Initiative in their diabetes analysis concluded that caution should be exercised in recommending a reduction in overall dietary fat in women with diabetes unless accompanied by additional recommendations to guide carbohydrate intake. In other words, they should be careful about eating so many carbs. If you're eating a low-fat diet, that is by definition a high-carb diet. So that was a piece of evidence that we have from Professor Noakes. There's also evidence from the all those trials that the clinical trials that we've talked about where they replaced saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, those trials on more than 65,000 people, where they, instead of butter, they were having margarine. Instead of milk, whole fat milk, they were having soy-filled milk and soy-filled cheese and soy burgers. In those trials, in the groups that were having the polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which is what we're told to eat today, they consistently saw higher rates of cancer in those groups having polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And this was found in the LA Dayton trial, it was found in the Mr. Fit trial, it was found in a couple of other NIH-funded trials, and there was so much concern about this side effect of cancer that there was a series of very high-level meetings at the National Institutes of Health in 1981 and 1982, 1983. I actually spoke to the rapporteur of who had been at those meetings, and they went through all the possible reasons why they saw these higher rates of cancers. They could not explain them. And at that point, there was so much momentum in favor of the diet heart hypothesis that they thought, well, given that we think we know this diet works against heart disease, we'll just ignore this side effect of cancer. When I spoke to the rapporteur who had been at that meeting, he said, gee, they still haven't figured that out? That's extraordinary. And in fact, they haven't. So it was also seen in those trials that there were consistently higher rates of gallstones in the experimental groups eating soybean oil. That was found in several trials. And it was consistently been found in people when they lower their cholesterol that they have higher rates of stroke. So, for instance, the Japanese are always presented as a much healthier population because they have lower rates of heart disease. And they have lower cholesterol levels, which is true. But they find that those populations have higher rates of stroke. Those rates are higher. The lower the cholesterol is, the higher the rate of stroke. And if they move to the United States, their risk of stroke goes down. In other words, if their cholesterol comes more in line with American levels of cholesterol. So it seems there may be some balance when you lower your cholesterol between the risk of stroke and other diseases.
Now, Mr. Schultz, from what you were saying before lunch, it's apparent that there's been a U-turn made in respect of the thinking about fats. Now, what has been the reaction of the international community in this regard?
So, when I describe the fact that the American Heart Association and the Dietary Guideline Committee no longer recommends a low-fat diet, this is something that they do not publicize. As you can see, there's no press release, there's no announcement. There's what I say. I wrote a opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal. I said they've tiptoed away from the low-fat diet, I presume that's because major institutions don't like to be seen reversing themselves, especially on such an extremely important piece of policy. One of the arguments that they now make is that we never told you to replace fat with refined carbohydrates. So the argument that they make is people are eating a low-fat diet, but instead of fat, they're eating the classic example in the United States is Snackwell's cookies. Cookies, low-fat cookies, very high in sugar, and so they said, Americans never should have, or people never should have lowered fat and gone out and eat all that junk food. That's what happened. There's just simply no evidence for that. Here's an example of the American Heart Association in 1995 saying, yes, do eat sugar and candy instead of fat. Here, where they're recommending eat sugar-sweetened gumdrops. And so there was actually a recommendation to eat more sugar. It was seen as healthier than fatty foods. Here's the U.S. government's Healthy People 2000 report asking to create 5,000 more packaged food items that would be lower in fat and saturated fat. One thing that's important to note is that fat is an important element of any manufactured food. So fat conveys flavor, it conveys it enables texture. You can't make many things without fat. So when you take out fat, when you manufacture a low-fat food, low-fat yogurt, low-fat peanut butter, low-fat bread, if you're taking fat out, you need to put in what is known in the jargon, which I learned at industry conferences, fat replacers. Fat replacers is a huge industry, and what they are is they're almost all carbohydrate-based, and often they're just sugar. So if you ask to create low-fat foods, those foods will almost by definition, be higher in carbohydrates than often just sugar. Low-fat yogurt is higher in sugar. Low-fat peanut butter is higher in sugar. They're all higher in carbohydrates. Low-fat granola bars is higher in sugar. So the government was actually requesting that we have low-fat foods that they, knowingly or not, would be higher in sugar.
Now, from what you've already said, Ms. Teicholz, there's a vast amount of data that is against the diet-heart hypothesis and the conventional information related to fats. Was this data considered in the formulation of the guidelines? And why, from your research, has this data and knowledge not been considered or incorporated in the formulation of the guidelines if they haven't been?
Yeah, and this is an extremely important question and really gets into why this story is so much more politics than science. We've seen a tremendous amount of science has been done, but it's been ignored. I went through every single iteration of the dietary guidelines from 1980, every 5 years they have 85, 90, I looked at all their citations. What were they citing? What were they looking at? Did they look at any of those clinical trials that I've reviewed here, that Dr. Harcombe reviewed? None of them are cited in any of the dietary guidelines. So they are effectively just been ignored, even though our government paid billions of dollars to have those trials done. Other governments paid hundreds of millions as well. So why were they ignored? Well, this comes down to this, what I want to talk about how critics of the dietary guidelines and the diet-heart hypothesis, how they were treated, what happened to them. And one of the questions that I always get is, it's not possible for Ancel Keys, this one man, to have, railroaded over the entire scientific community with his idea. That's just not possible. And of course that isn't. But what happened is that, and there were critics to the diet-heart hypothesis, and I want to talk a little bit about them and what happened to them so you can understand how the debate played out and why we don't know about all these clinical trials, this vast storehouse of data. So one of those critics was Texas A&M professor Theodore Reiser, He wrote an extensive critique of the diet-hard hypothesis in 1973 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, a premier, well-known journal in the United States. In response, Ancel Keys responded with a 24-page reply saying that Reiser's analysis, these are just a few of the many insults that he made, reminds one of the distorting mirrors in the Hall of Jokes at a county fair. It's the typical distortion. It would be difficult to pack more imprecision in a 16-word sentence. Reiser completely ignores, obviously Reiser has no comprehension. This is what Ancel Keys wrote about his colleague without dealing with any of the many legitimate points that Dr. Reiser had made. He was a Texas at A&M University, a well-known, well-respected university. Reiser replied in a short letter to the journal. Reluctantly, he said, because I feel I must give some rebuttal to the accusation that I have tried to smear the scientists whose papers I reviewed and that I have deliberately lied. So Pete Ahrens was the most prominent critic of Ancel Keys. He was a highly revered lipidologist, that means somebody who studies fats at the Rockefeller University. He was editor of journals and participated at the highest level. And he repeatedly said over and over, we must urge caution and restraint. We must not make policy based on weak data. He would say over and over again, when unproved hypotheses are enthusiastically proclaimed as facts, it is timely to reflect on the possibility that other explanations can be given for the phenomenon observed, which is sort of science speak for there is not enough science for this policy. We cannot enshrine the diet-hard hypothesis as policy because the science is not there. And again, he made this argument, he was deceased by the time I started my work, but I spoke to several of his students who told me there's no question that Ahrens lost grants, didn't get invited to panels. I noticed in looking at the various expert panels that his name was dropped. He's no longer involved in the top levels at the NIH. And he knew that he had paid the price for going up against the establishment. I call him the Cassandra of of this whole story because he continually, his voice was not heard. So George Mann, another critic, he was a biochemist at the University of Vanderbilt. He was also very prominent. He was a lead investigator of one of the most famous NIH studies in the history of nutrition science, named the Framingham Study. He did a completely fascinating study where he took a mobile laboratory to Kenya in the 1960s, where he studied a group of Maasai warriors, and he found that they had no traces of heart disease, which in itself was a surprise because at that time in the United States, people just thought heart disease was inevitable. But he found that they had low blood cholesterol. It did not rise with age, which was surprising. He took electrocardiograms of 600 of them and could find almost no trace of any heart attack. And they had low cholesterol and low blood pressure. And then he looked at what they ate. They were eating 3 to 5 pounds of meat a day, and 3 to 5 liters of milk every day. And what they didn't have in milk, they had in meat. They had many pounds of meat every day. Basically, they had a diet of meat, milk, and blood. That was their entire diet. What we would consider a complete failing grade diet. They should be dying of heart attacks right and left, and yet he found they were in perfect health. And then he, suspecting that they might have some kind of genetic protection, he followed them to Nairobi, a group where they had changed their diet habits and ate more like the people in the city. He found that their cholesterol started to rise and look like those people, looked like everyone else, so it didn't seem like they were afforded any particular genetic protection. And he published all those studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and they were all completely ignored. So nobody paid any attention to them. I want to just say one thing about George Mann before I do that, about his work on the Framingham study. Again, one of the biggest ever studies, and the Framingham studies were the biggest studies to try to see what could predict heart disease, what risk factors. Was it smoking? Was it your cholesterol level? Was it a sedentary lifestyle? And they followed 5,000 men in a little town outside of Boston over for decades. And for a while, Dr. Mann was the head of the nutritional portion of that study, and he said he calculated the results he spent 2 years collecting food consumption data from 1,000 subjects. He calculated his results in 1960, and it was clear that saturated fat was not related to heart disease. So he wrote in his paper that between coronary heart disease and diet, the authors concluded no relationship found. And I actually spoke to Dr. Mann when he was in a nursing home, and he was quite bitter and in his 90s. He told me, that went over like a wet blanket with my superiors at NIH because it was contrary to what they wanted us to find. And so, and this has been confirmed, Mann's results lay in an NIH basement for nearly a decade. As he says, to withhold scientific information is a form of cheating. And then when the findings eventually came out in 1968, they were buried in a 28-volume report, such that nobody really still knows that they exist. And only in 1992 were they acknowledged by one of the then directors of the Framingham study, who wrote, they weren't really public, he put them in like an opinion piece, so they weren't really an official finding. And he wrote, in the Framingham study, the more saturated fat one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol, and they weighed the least. But of course, nobody knows that. So, continuing on George Mann, he became more outspoken in his criticism than anyone else, and he talks about how that was completely devastating to his career, that he couldn't get his scientific articles accepted, it was increasingly difficult to speak out. He was virtually banned from prominent publications by the American Heart Association. He also told me a story that he had one of his grants at the NIH, that one day a secretary called him out into the hallway and said, if you continue your opposition to Ancel Keys, it's going to cost you your research grant. And shortly thereafter, he lost it.